Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining. I hope some of you have been involved and seen some of our prior webinars. We have a new one, a new group today, a large group of faculty and staff that are helping put this together. So first, we've done a number of things during COVID, through the academic initiative. American Academy of Neurology has been there to try to support both practicing neurologists in training, as well as our academic colleagues out there. First early webinars that are online and can be found were about best practices for inpatient services, including neurocritical care, stroke, neurohospitalists. And then the second was from New York City's response, and we heard from some individuals from the New York City when they were in the midst of their COVID-19 surge in April. Next slide. We did a few others as we began to get out of the surge and talked about reactivation, more on the clinical side. So for clinical operations, we have a webinar that heard from chairs about how they brought clinical operations back up. And then we also had one that dealt with education and training, how to deal now with interviewing for residency, all going virtual and fellowships. And that was well done in teaching our medical students with, particularly in this age of virtual neurology. Neurology Departments addressing systemic racism we did in July, and that was a different one off COVID topic, but an important one. And there were some really interesting stories that people shared about racism that affected their individual departments. And there are many other things that the Academy is about to do since the large task force to address racism and deal with equity, diversity, inclusion has made some recommendations that the board are beginning to look at. And then managing financial repercussions, that was done on the end of July regarding layoffs, changes in salaries, affecting your retirement plans, things like that all of us are going through. All of these are available at AAN.com and the AAN YouTube channel. Next slide. So today's focus is focused specifically on research operations, resetting research operations within neurology departments during COVID-19. We know that second surges and other surges and mini surges or large surges may still be to come, and some of us things have reduced. And so we're going to be hearing from the panelists about how they handle things and what some of the opportunities are that have come from COVID-19. Next slide. So I have a great group of panelists from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Mark Mailer, who's the department chair there, from the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Tom Carmichael is with us, as well as Jeff White, his Chief Administrative Officer of Neurology and Neurosurgery. And from Mass General, we have the chair there, Merit Sokovich, is with us. Next slide. And then from the University of Miami, myself, I'm here more to moderate, but Rebecca Lee, who's my Vice Chair for Administration. And then hearing from a clinical trials research coordinator and manager, Letty Ginsburg, is with us. From the University of Nebraska, where we just heard, they are undergoing a big surge right now. We have Matt Rizzo, who's the department chair there. And then from the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston, Louise McCullough, the department chair there. So as I said, this is all about research, and I thought we'd start on the positive side. You know, in the positive side, there are some opportunities that have developed with COVID-19, both in terms of academics, addressing interesting COVID questions, resources that may become available from clinical to laboratory research resources, as well as other opportunities about even the pathophysiology of COVID in the brain. So I thought I'd start to hear from Matt a little bit. Matt, tell us a little bit about some resources that you think have become more available now since COVID.
Thanks, Ralph. I think we're all more connected. We've all pivoted together toward COVID, and there are a lot of opportunities for us networking and working together. And there are a few of them, and one that is really prominent has been supported by the NIH, and it's called N3C. It's the National COVID Cohort Collaborative. And what it does is, rather than take a federated model in which each institution analyzes its data and then those data are aggregated, is to have a centralized model with standard tools, standard software, where data are aggregated over time into a gigantic database, this N3C, that can be analyzed by anyone who belongs and anyone who has access to it. So this is an opportunity for neurologists who belong to places all over the country that have CTSAs or practice-based research networks or clinical and translational research networks to enter in, to join. There's a concierge or white glove service to help you figure out what software to use. If you're not an IT person, there are all sort of arcane terms like Coronet and ACT and I2B2 and Trinetics, and maybe you will glaze over and you have no idea what they are, but there are IT people to help you to figure out to get your data in the right structure and in, so you can answer important questions over time, like are some therapies better than others? What's happening in a certain region or a certain cohort, like American Indian, demographics? Who's going to have better outcomes? Who's going to have more severe outcomes? This all matters to us a lot, right? Because there are a lot of neurologic sequelae of COVID that I'm sure we're going to be talking about later today. There are also possibilities of figuring out what are best algorithms, possibilities of doing drug discovery for COVID, multimodal analytics, and we can all learn about that. Best practices for resource allocation, which we're talking about all the time as department heads now. So it's a great opportunity. And if anybody's interested, I can try to get you hooked in.
Yeah, this is a huge cohort. CTSAs that put it together through NCATS. There are some others. The cohort of cohorts now is being done among cohort studies that are taking and adding in COVID data as well. And I think NHLBI is helping run that. And there are other opportunities, including tissue and brain banks, that are becoming available. So these are, again, research opportunities and grant funding that could go with it. For Alzheimer's disease, there's amazing opportunities there as well to help with the Alzheimer's disease cohorts that are collecting genetic information. What about the science and thinking about, the brain and COVID? We've heard about stroke, about coagulopathy, maybe encephalopathy, the pathophysiology. Mark, what do you think are some of the new research questions about COVID in the brain that have surfaced and that may move us into even new areas?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak. And first of all, we're dealing with a whole new biology. Everybody who has dealt with a patient realizes that critical care illness in the body is like nothing we've ever seen before across the board. And in the brain, similarly, we're seeing atypical presentations of what we used to learn were neurologic syndromes that now we find are harder to classify. So what I want to give a sense of is what's going on and how does it relate to each other and what are the opportunities. So if you think about what's going on, there's a dramatic alteration in homeostasis in the body, resulting in critical care illnesses that the likes of which we've never seen, and neurologic manifestations, the likes of which we've never seen. What is less clear, but is becoming more clear, is that those two are interrelated and are interrelated at a very dynamic level. So it's very clear from research we and others are doing that the brain affects the body in dramatic ways. It alters peripheral end organs. So it alters their viability. It alters their homeostasis. It alters the elaboration of coagulopathies. It alters vasculopathies. It alters hypoxemia and the ability to sense it properly. And then when you go to the nervous system, it turns out that all these alterations in the body are impacting on the brain. But in addition, there is within the brain itself a very complex neurotropism that is different than we've ever seen. So for example, we used to say certain cell types are, more likely to be harbingers of this and so forth. What we now realize is that the ACE2 receptor, which is the receptor for the virus, is dynamically regulated, not just by the virus in individual cells, but within a whole ecosystem that makes up the cell. And moreover, there are links between the downstream signaling from the ACE2 receptor, particularly through the renin-angiotensin system, and feedbacks to the brain. both to the central nervous system, to areas in the lower brainstem that are cardiorespiratory centers, to higher cognitive centers, and more importantly, to autonomic centers that feed the periphery and actually monitor homeostatic reflexes peripherally. And so what we're realizing is that the brain has a dynamic rheostat that helps establish the normality of body functions and vice versa. And by being able to study the downstream signaling from the ACE2 receptor and the ability to actually do trials on patients, what we found is that when we looked at over 6,000 patients, which have basically come through our system during the height of the surge, it looks like probably 60 to 80% have some neurologic manifestation. And if you look at the critical care illness and how it portends in hospital mortality, what you find is when you factor in every possible indices of critical care illness, there's a component above and beyond that which relates to the brain. So what we're studying now is the fact that for the first time, the brain has a homeostatic role in all of body functions that is very advanced, and where we can use pharmaceuticals, which we can repurpose, that have been used in the peripheral nervous system and through circadian rhythms and other things to actually begin to tackle these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I mean, it is opening up some new, whole new concepts that we're less aware of. This whole idea of multi-system, it also brings up multidisciplinary. And I think on the clinical side, Merritt, what do you think are some of the opportunities, particularly like opportunities for collaboration on therapeutic side?
You know, I think we saw at all the institutions the need for teams to come together and get a little out of their comfort zone to help care for patients in the ICU and the floors. And from that has led to all these new collaborations for research. You know, some examples are really working with our radiology colleagues and our pulmonary colleagues to understand people who were who looked like they had disorders of consciousness, and whether and to try to prognosticate. There's a whole slew of immunology, neuroimmunologists who have started to work with their infectious disease colleagues to try to understand the inflammatory reaction to this illness. And actually, a lot of the drugs being tried in trials for COVID are ones that are being tried in neurodegenerative diseases, because there's a lot of overlap in the changes in the immune system. So I think it's been a huge opportunity, especially for young investigators, to branch out to some new areas, to meet some new colleagues. I was really impressed, by how everybody stepped in to help, from the clinicians to the researchers, and even like lending equipment. And every time you get like new people together, you get new ideas. And I think we've all seen, kind of, I guess, more neuroinfectious disease people, interest coming from that.
Well, true team science. I mean, and this is just the ultimate call for team science. When you have the people across different disciplines trying to focus on a pandemic, it definitely brings people together in a quick way. So, these are the opportunities. On the opportunity side, new science, new idea about pathophysiology, new ideas of working together to combat something that we're all dealing with. There are some negative consequences as well. And again, tonight is also about best practices. And so we want to start a little bit on the laboratory research side. Obviously some people have had their work interrupted. When we've had shutdowns, we've had to shut down labs and halt people coming into offices as well as to the lab work. So, there's different ways to approach this. And I thought I was going to ask Tom a little bit about, how the pandemic has particularly affected laboratory work. How are people shutting their labs, planning to reopen them now, hopefully? And then what are some of the principles that have been followed regarding laboratory operations?
Thanks, Ralph. I think there are three principles that as chairs or leaders in our department that we've successfully adapted that matter here. And that's engagement, flexibility, and local advocacy. So as physician scientists, we're uniquely able to engage the entire spectrum of concern here. We understand the viral biology, we understand the mitigation measures, but we also understand the tension on lab research, on junior faculty in particular, and on the need for progress in our grant-supported activities. So I think we are in a unique position to take the on high pronouncements that sometimes descend upon us and then translate that to an effective way in the department. An example might be a lab that's large and adopts not a team approach, shifts, which many smaller labs can do, but starts to go to this crazy Google Calendar. Right. And we might have an environmental health and safety group say you can't do that. And you say, no, actually this meets phase 2, which for most of us was one person per 250 square feet. And this is how it does that. So I think engagement is the key there for the physician scientist chair or the leaders in the department. And then flexibility to allow labs to find the solutions within the guidelines that work. And finally, local advocacy. I think many of us have been in the middle of this, where we are in a unique position to advocate for our faculty so that they could find a solution that works and still fits the guideline. I've had cases in which, most institutions encourage self-reporting, essentially allowing faculty to report on other faculty, and there's certainly value in that. But as chairs, we might get a report that there's a kid in Neurology Building 1. And you track it down, and a daycare closed that day, and so there was an hour or two in which a young faculty member needed to be with their child before they found another solution. And I think that local advocacy is also critical.
Yeah, that's critical, the flexibility. Are most of the rules that we've all dealt with coming from above? Like at our place, the vice provost for research for the whole university put down these rules. And then obviously the dean, the executive dean for research at the School of Medicine helped interpret them. Where have the rules come from?
They certainly, in my institution and in the UC system, as I talked to colleague chairs, came from usually their vice chancellor, their executive vice chancellor, that level. So definitely from on high. On high
down. But yeah, the flexibility was how you as a department or a division or a laboratory helped interpret and work the best way around, keeping within the rules and the guidelines to keep with the compliance as best you can.
Yes.
Yeah. Not easy, but and you have that. I think ours was 200 square feet. You were 250 square feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think we had 200, but we're tighter for space, I guess. What about on the clinical side? Merritt, when you think about this, clinical trials, observational studies, how have things changed? I mean, virtual consent, we're doing tons of it now. Tell us a little bit on the clinical side.
Yeah, first of all, we're in such a time for neurotherapeutics that we really have to advocate and work together to make sure that those trials don't get stopped. I think at the beginning of COVID, the focus was on COVID trials, and many institutions stopped other trials. But it's back to what Tom was saying about the advocacy, that these studies are really important too, and we can't stop research. And how can you do that? And we saw things get much easier that we always wanted to do but couldn't do, like virtual consent, or doing the visits virtually, doing them cross state lines. Hopefully some of these changes will be here to stay for our patients who have disabilities. But it does take a lot of advocacy and talking to the IRB chair and trying to come up with creative solutions with your colleagues. One example, in the world of ALS is we couldn't do breathing tests for, and some institutions still can't do them because of the risk to the person doing it. And so we had to come up with how do you do that in the home. So I think we've seen an explosion of home devices, and the field was kind of going that way anyhow, but this in a weird positive way, I think accelerated the use of home devices and virtual visits for research.
And we've been monitoring devices now with other physiologic changes. And I think you're right. And I think this is changing how we follow up patients in studies. We already knew that it was possible, but now I think it's pushed us much further into reality. Somebody did send in a question a little earlier that said, for existing trials, are you incorporating any COVID testing? I guess if the patient's coming in to be seen for a follow-up in the trials, and I guess these are non-COVID related studies, but anybody dealing with that, Merit, have you done any COVID testing in your trials?
No, we're not. We're treating it the same as the patient's outpatient, which is they get the questionnaire before, 24 hours before, and they can bring one person with them, but there's not active COVID testing. But I think this is very institution dependent.
Anybody else doing like COVID testing before a clinical trial patient has to come in? No, we haven't required that. The symptom checker is the main thing. And then the other question that came in was, go ahead. Yep.
Inpatient, obviously, because we're screening all the patients that come in inpatient. So for like acute stroke trials, we do know whether they're COVID positive because they'll get a rapid test, but not on the outpatient side.
So for do all of your inpatients get COVID testing, or all of your inpatients do?
Yep.
That's great. And then also the question came in about observational studies. Different. I mean, for example, in our place, the Northern Manhattan study, we're doing follow-up. We've shifted everything to virtual. Neuropsych testing virtually is kind of tricky, but there are ways to do it, and it's been a learning curve. But observational studies, how have they adapted? Anybody, Merit, did you want to tackle that, or anybody else?
I think at the beginning, a lot of them were put on hold, but they've adapted exactly how you described to go virtual and again, to try to add maybe some devices or some creative ways to do the assessments virtually.
So I thought it'd be helpful to hear from somebody who's a research manager, clinical trial coordinator. So Letty, from your perspective as a clinical trial coordinator, what do you think some of the challenges are? How do you get ready for that site visit when the clinical trial manager from pharma was coming in to check? Tell us a little bit from your perspective.
So I agree with the panel as well. I think this is a great opportunity for all of us to think creatively. So what happened with us was, particularly in Boca, where I'm working as a coordinator, we had drug trials and we couldn't really let down people and stop that. So we had to come up with a creative ways. How can we continue this? So we did immediately speak out to the IRB, to the sponsors. They quickly came up with the amendments, and we were able to administer all the surveys virtually. And in addition, one of the things that came up was, how do we give them the IP, the investigational product? So we came up with an idea, and this is where we need communication always with the patient to prepare them to what's going on, and creativity. So what happened was that the patient would come to the clinic, and we already knew that we set up a box. They had their IP to return. I had mine to give to them, and we swapped. Nobody had to get out of the car. So these are the different things that are occurring.
So the questions come in, and this one was something else to think about. The CROs always want to do the source documentation, and the person's asking, what do you do when, especially the hospital's limiting people coming in, university doesn't want external vendors coming into the campus. If you have to start Xeroxing things and faxing things, it's asking, with all this remote monitoring, what are you doing to work around that?
Well, at the beginning, no one could come in, obviously. So what we did is basically do remote monitoring. So the monitors would share their screen, and I'd share my screen and we would work on data. And that's our opportunity to work on data and have our pre-screening and everything ready to go. Now, what I would do is I would choose different times to come in, and I would scan documents that they needed. So we were able to continue it, but it was a virtual communication.
And a lot of extra work, I would say, right?
A lot of extra work, but what was really great to see is how all the coordinators came together, and they were actually asked to do other jobs to assist during that time. So I felt that everybody was, the networking. And one important thing I wanted to say, Dr. Saka, is one of the initiatives that we had and that came out of this was that now that we have in our COEs, our Center of Excellence, multidisciplinary clinics, we are able to refer patients during that clinic to physical therapists, occupational therapists, and speech language pathologists virtually. So it has helped us and our patients receive the treatment and care they need during the clinic visit.
Great.
Because we have the people coming in.
Important thoughts. PPE is a big issue, making sure we have PPE for especially our people on the front line, but our research support staff. Rebecca, you want to talk a little bit about PPE and how that's gone, particularly when it comes to research?
Yes, so being one of the partial bean counters on this panel as a vice chair for administration, one of the things, of course, that we're always looking at is the financial side of things. And so PPE obviously is not something that we are unfamiliar with, but none of us were having to get it in the quantities that we're now having to get it, and especially for the researchers, et cetera. And so part of this was saying, like we always do when we're building a budget with the pharmaceutical company, especially, is to look at them and say, we want to make sure that they're paying their fair share to cover our costs so that we're not working for them for free. And so part of this was also reaching out to them to say, look, we've got an added cost that wasn't anything we could have foreseen. And we'd like to know if you will participate with us by providing us some additional funds to offset cost of our PPE that we're having to provide for patients and for ourselves and for everything else. And so we just wanted to make sure that other people were aware that we have gotten, at least from our end in Miami, we have gotten positive responses, and we have gotten them to send us additional funds to help offset some of those costs.
So save those invoices, because one of the questions did come in about this is, can the extra cost, not just for PPE, maybe extra time and effort, and at least we should try, particularly I know for pharma-sponsored ones, but even for NIH. Administrative supplements are available for certain NIH grants, so it is possible to recoup some of the finances. Matt, another question that had come in about imaging research. We paused imaging for a while, we restarted imaging. There was a backlog now in clinical imaging. How about handling the resumption of imaging research? Any thoughts there?
The imaging research is very much the same, with the same care and diligence and staged approach as with other research. We have to make sure that everybody has the PPE that's required for other research. That includes masks. One has to be very diligent about cleaning equipment. There may be some requirements for wearing visors, even for patients who are being imaged. There are perhaps added complications when a research machine is shared, as it often is, to pay for the machine between research and clinical activities. And so then there's the extra scrupulousness of cleaning in between patients and subjects, and switching of teams between a research team and a clinical team. So, it's like with every other research endeavor, it's that, safety has the utmost priority, and one has to be very attentive to all of the regulations for keeping safe and keeping distant and wearing protection.
And it takes a little extra time, so we have to be patient, and even the people that are coming to support our research subjects coming in, there are less visitors and family members that can come. So there was a good question that was sent in here that I thought Tom would try to handle, which is, anybody have an issue where your CMO or CEO does not share the idea that inpatient research should resume? We have all these researchers that want to get going again. The surge is left, it's becoming safer. We talked about that. What do you do when the CEO or CMO says, I don't really want to open up yet to inpatient research? Tom.
I think that's a great question. The long answer to that is, hopefully you've sort of set the stage for such a discussion before the epidemic hit, because it's this issue of alignment. And so the health system, the hospital, is aligned towards return on investment and financial metrics of performance and revenues, and of course cutting expenses. So all that whole profit and loss statement is in front of their eyes. And so when they turn around and start to look at the clinical research enterprise, it's often advantageous to talk to them, and in this specific example, it remains so, in ways in which they understand the ROI, or the return on investment. All of us are at top-notch academic medical centers in which the draw to patient care is often the access to cutting-edge ideas, physicians that are the leading edge of their field, clinical trials and diseases that may have a few therapies. And so it's actually part of our ROI, part of our business model to offer and reinstitute the clinical trials. And I think it's hard to initiate that de novo in a discussion with a chief financial officer in the midst of a pandemic. So hopefully there's been a little bit of this ahead of time, but why not now? So you might as well say, hey, this is part of our brand. This is how we achieve market share in a crowded city with many private practitioners or community hospitals. And I think to me, that's the main angle, because it's hard to justify it on a pure return on investment otherwise.
Right. It's different. Academic medical centers, it's what differentiates us in the market, as you say, and it's our reason for being. And hopefully a good CEO or COO or chief clinical officer understands that it also brings up reputation and drives the clinical patients to an academic medical center. But you're right, you should be doing that before the pandemic, and hopefully they're on board even after the pandemic. Another last question regarding on clinical research, and this is for Louise. Louise, what are some of the approaches you use to kind of keep the clinical teams working together? They're not seeing each other. They're definitely working from home. They're doing virtual consents. How do you keep that camaraderie and productivity going with the team?
It's a great point, because a lot of times people, when they're not collaborating in person, they get a little disengaged. So really keeping up that engagement is what I found to be key. Having very clear scheduled meeting times, and you can do that by Zoom, you can do that by WebEx, you can do it in smaller groups, socially distanced, especially over the past couple months as some of the numbers have dropped a little bit. I think really just having people be accountable and having them be engaged is really kind of kept these research teams together, and continuing to kind of remember why we're here, why are we doing these research trials, how important it is to our patients, to really kind of keep the patients engaged, and that requires keeping the team engaged. So I found giving very consistent updates at regular time intervals was the most helpful.
Communication as much as possible. I've always been a meeting person. Now you're doing more meetings virtually to keep people together. We're going to turn a little bit now to productivity. And Mark, this is one for you where, productivity has been interrupted. Let's talk about laboratory research first. Obviously, if your staff can't come in, the postdocs can't be there. We're in the height of the surge now, and things have been reduced in terms of your productivity. What are some of the approaches you use? And let's maybe break it down to, like, for NIH grants, where the financial, grant revenues there, but your productivity is stalled. Do you have any recommendations and guidance there?
Sure. I think a lot now is multidisciplinary research, right? I mean, interdisciplinary research. And I think that what we've tried to do as an institution is one to form what we call collaboratories, where people throughout the university can work together on common teams. Number two, we subspecialize more than we normally do, to the extent that somebody who's a physiologist, needs to be in and has his rig and do his work. There are other people who are bioinformatics people or systems biologists who can do a lot of dry bench work at home or off-site. We try to maintain social distance. We try to divide the team up so that subspecialty areas can maximize what they can do in the maximum space, be it virtual space, be it in-house space, be it collaborative space. And I think it's really important to keep that going. I think we're not going to know for a long time the psychological impact of all this on all frontline workers. And I think one of the ways that we can do preventative medicine is really to keep people engaged in their research, get them involved in COVID-related research if it makes sense.
Right.
And often it becomes part of the mission, or use their expertise to teach other people areas which are evolving as the pandemic evolves.
Yeah, great thoughts. I mean, there are some other practical issues. There are no cost extensions. There are administrative supplements. The NIH is flexible, and they will understand Clinical trials are often supported sometimes per patient reimbursement. There are other ways to at least get some support from NIH. This is where philanthropic funds will come in to support investigators, and we'll talk about that again in a moment. NIH, my sense, has been pretty flexible with investigators, both on basic as well as clinical research. What about pharma trials? Anybody have some thoughts about, when time is lost, to make up the lost time with no cost extensions for recruitment into trials? Anybody have a thought there on the clinical trial side? Merit, maybe for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of pharma trials were kind of put on hold for a while, and they've given extensions and tried to also shift things to home nurses for blood draws or shipping to patients. I think you just have to be very proactive to get those extensions because everyone wants the trial to finish. It's just going to take a little longer.
It's going to take a little longer. So we're going to turn now to a big area of concern, young investigators. Young investigators are a pipeline. We've been doing the best we can to, support their career development. Some of them have even grants from the AAN that we allowed no cost extensions, but it's a no cost extension. They often are on protected time. So I was going to talk to Louise as a chair. What do you deal with? How do you help your young investigators where the grant we now have sort of run out, or they couldn't get their work done and they were in a timeline supported grant? Thoughts about how we can support our young investigators during this period?
It is critical. We cannot let this pandemic kill our pipeline. So we need to protect, of all people that we need to protect, it's our junior investigators, our beginning scientists, our people that are just starting out. They're the most vulnerable. So, with some of mine, I've really tried to encourage them to be as productive as possible, even if they're out of the lab or they're out of the clinic. It's a great time to catch up on doing, the outcomes or the chart reviews that you needed to do. It's a good time to catch up on papers, and hopefully what we'll see is a rebound, 6 to 12 months, that they took this time and they were able to write grants and write specific aims, and hopefully they'll bear fruit 6 months or 12 months from now. As far as, especially on these AAN grants, ANA grants, American Heart, that's where I think that it's been very difficult. I don't know if you're aware, the American Heart pushed back all their award deadlines and didn't award some of the grants. I think especially highly philanthropic funded organizations are having to do that because they're not getting that philanthropic support because other people have been hit financially by the crisis. I just think it's very important as a chair that you find money. You just have to find it. It just becomes a priority. We were able to do some vacation savings and use up vacation time, and that gave us a little bit of flexibility to protect some of our junior faculty that are on these kind of timeline-driven grants. The NIH has been flexible with things like K awards, but it's harder if it's a 1 or 2 year grant. But I do think it's really a priority to protect these young folks.
We all agree. The longer the grant, obviously, the easier.
Easier it is.
5-year K-23, then, and hopefully you're not in your last year, it's better. There was a question that came in here that talked also about the push, because the push to do more clinical, if the research is closed down, and then the shift from that protected research time to clinical time. But Jeff, at UCLA, how have you handled some of this on the financial side? How to protect time in somebody where the grant is still ticking away and they're going to go into a no-cost extension without the money that the chair needs to support their salary? What do you think?
Right. Well, what Louise said really resonated when she said the chair needs to find money. I feel you have to be proactive at the department level. Obviously, we're in a time where sort of every sphere of the academic medical center is feeling the effects of COVID, and I'm sure, like many other institutions, UCLA was losing quite a bit of revenue in the clinical enterprise during that dip that we had in COVID a few months ago, and we're still battling back from that. And that, of course, translates to lack of resources being available for the other missions of the AMC as well. I feel like Tom has been excellent at being proactive in engaging with our junior faculty and making sure they're paired up with mentors at engaging with them at regular intervals to make sure that they're not just going adrift. Tom sends out a weekly email to all of the faculty with funding opportunities. And so it's just very important to have that support culture as part of the framework, especially in a time when, things are tighter than usual. And also thinking about novel ways with philanthropy, really encouraging and inspiring those junior faculty to really think through their research and share those novel concepts that we can then leverage with our development team to try and find sources of philanthropic support for. But yeah, it's not easy, and there's not a real quick fix.
Our research, we used to always talk about a rainy day fund. Well, this is the time to use the rainy day fund if you have it as a chair, if there are some money centrally supported to help, particularly for those young investigators in their protected efforts. It's really critical. Matt, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I just wanted to make one point that's slightly different, and it's that it's important to have the rainy day fund. It's also important to do a lot of hand-holding with the young investigators who are very distraught over not getting their research done on time. And some of them are not particularly astute at getting through the systems that we've built up for administering research through sponsored programs or the IRB or IT, you name it. So it's important to help to move through their request to reopen their research because they don't know the ropes, and you can save them weeks or months of time that they can get more research done and save opportunity cost.
And this is where the mentorship comes in that Jeff mentioned and others that is critical, and networking them within your department with you other investigators. And also the time down is a great time to write up, even if they only had the pilot investigation done and not everything, that still could be a publishable piece of work. So speaking of that, when we turn to scholarly activity and promotion, as the time continues and they're on these tenure or even non-tenure track, promotional tracks, Mara, what do you think about promotions? How are we going to find some innovative ways to keep that scholarly activity going and keep them in making the progress towards promotion?
I hope all the young investigators are listening, see and feel how much the chairs care about the future of our field and supporting you. I think there's lots of innovative ways we can help on the promotion so people stay on track. And one idea that I know a lot of centers have done is to try to get their young faculty giving talks, giving grand rounds, or giving seminars, putting in abstracts, because now a lot of places are doing more web-based talks, and especially for people with young children who maybe didn't travel as much before, this is an opportunity for them to give grand rounds or give talks. And so a lot of the chairs are actually talking to each other and say, okay, I have 3 people that I would love to give talks to at your place. Can you arrange for this? And so we're really trying to promote that for our young people so that their work gets out there and they can network virtually, and that will help their promotion.
And that still gets listed on a CV. It's a talk, it's virtual, it counts. So it should be helping them as well as their publishing material. Let's turn a little bit to sex differences. This has come up, child care issues, other ways that we can support women in academic neurology. Louise, you had some interesting ideas in terms of even working on weekends and after hours. Share with us some of these best practices.
So especially, and this holds for women and young men with young families, it's become a big challenge, especially with virtual schooling. You can't leave your kid home with an iPad. Well, you can if they're like 16, but not if they're like 3. So, somebody has to be home to make sure they're actually doing what they're doing. So a lot of my faculty, we've worked out things where they can come in, because it can be very difficult to get anything useful done when there's small children around. It can be very distracting, but having 2 parents at home may not be ideal right now. So dad stays home Monday, Wednesday, Friday, mom stays home Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday. They work a split shift on the weekend. It does put stress on the family a little bit that you're never all together, but it does keep their research progress going, their clinical progress going. And that seems to be working out relatively well. That way, one of the significant others can be home, it becomes much more of a challenge if it's a single parent. And we have had these type of situations, and especially if the child or children are at home, it can be very difficult. And then you just have to be flexible. You have to try and allow for as much virtual and after hours work as you can. It requires a lot of structured and really commitment on the faculty's part to stay to task. Okay, from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., I must do this. But the rest of the time I'm going to be doing that. So even if they can block out 2 or 4 hours of very productive time, we're making it work.
And schooling, sometimes doing the homeschooling if the schools are closed or open.
Exactly.
And childcare services aren't available at some of the institutions. Merit, it looks like you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say the flexibility is really key, and even like for the faculty that see patients, to allow them to do virtual visits on the weekend or when it works for them. Some institutions have provided some support, financial support for hiring people to help. Not everybody feels comfortable having someone help them, but looking at those opportunities at your state or at your university to help you.
Great. So everything we can do as a chair to help support, we want to support single parents, women, as well as men who have child caring responsibilities that could be affecting their academic productivity. So let's turn now towards the end here, the financial repercussions. We've heard, and there was a good comment that came into the chat box here that talks about departments are now in deficit, pausing clinical activity, particularly if there were a big surge. Clinician investigators are asked to do more clinical work that's reducing their time for research. Salary cuts may be being required to make up the deficits in clinical revenue, and some of this is all causing these financial repercussions, layoffs, other things. Tom, at UCLA, what has happened, and how have you maybe dealt with some of these financial fallout of COVID?
Yeah, well, probably like most on this call and most listeners, we've been on this like a laser. So we have a dashboard that tracks pre-COVID to COVID with real-time data from our electronic health record to understand mostly charges, because of course billings tail, and we want to understand as people switch to video visits, as we struggle with what our cap is in terms of how many in-person visits we can have, how are people charging? And we found that when people were struggling to charge, not by time, but by medical reasoning and exam, they were falling down and our charges were going down. And so we've had to meet with each clinician, discuss time-based billing. This is a separate webinar, but
Right.
Of course it's coming in January and even more, in even more of a level. So it allows us to reinforce for us to use time. This is how you get to level 4 and 5. This is how you get your charges back to where you were, because we can, and we focus like that with dashboard metrics very strongly, because I think we're still in the middle of it. We can recover if we take active movement now.
So on the research side, for example, the research money has continued to flow.
Yeah.
When we were doing mitigation, we were told, people who had at risk were the clinicians more than the researchers, because that money was still coming in. And even the layoffs were less, and salary cuts were less on the research side. Anybody, or Tom or others, any thoughts about, kind of the disproportionate effect of the financial repercussions on research? Did you have any?
Well, I'll say a quick comment.
Yep.
As we've recognized, the NIH has not decremented research. We have resumed many clinical trials, and the grants we have, even if they're foundation grants, are continuing to fund, and we're able to hit targets. So the researchers at the moment haven't been hit very hard. I think what we're at risk of is newness, innovation, new directions. It's going to be very hard to initiate these if we can't train people face to face. We can't engage our research cores, our FACS core, our sequencing core with new projects and people that may not have been in those cores before. That's where these distancing and contact regulations may really hit us, is new directions and innovation. I worry about that.
Now, capital is another issue. At our place, I know some big capital things are put on hold, but even some little capital things are hurting us. So Rebecca, What about capital equipment costs, particularly when it relates to research? How's that been handled?
Well, I think one of the things in the research world, especially on the basic science side, is they've always had a good handle on keeping a good stock of duct tape in case things break, because their resources are often, it's hard to find things and get what they need. But we all are in a place, I think, where our capital dollars, everybody pretty much across the board, across the nation, I think everyone had a freeze on their capital spending. And our institution is just coming out now to tell us what we can spend for the rest of the fiscal year. And we had to make some very difficult choices as to what's going to be allowed. And not everybody's going to be happy, of course, but I think it's really getting the group together, getting your whole team, both the research side and the clinical side to help understand we got to be very careful with our equipment and stretch things out until we absolutely, try to get into the next fiscal year.
And space. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Louise.
I will say one thing. The people that sell this capital equipment also have been hit hard. So look for deals. Don't pay full price. So they're trying to, because a lot of the production continued. I mean, there was a break, but they have stuff. And so if there is a very good piece of equipment or a relatively pricey piece of equipment, shop around, because it is a good time to get deals on stuff.
So a COVID sale, you're saying it does exist. Okay. And what about space, Merit? Space is always an issue at most academic places. What if you were looking about new leases or new opportunities to extend? How are you thinking space differently during COVID?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a long period of time where there aren't new leases, and that after the pandemic, when people come home, we'll have to rethink how we use space. We've also, I think, learned that for some groups, actually, they work very well at home, and it might be something that they want to continue or do a hybrid. So I think that we have to rethink maybe this idea of one office, one person, but more maybe hoteling or sharing of space. That always makes people nervous. I think, the more we can get ahead of it and be creative and, again, share the best practices, the more likely we can get people back safely when this is all over.
The bottom line for everyone also is the finances of philanthropy. And we touched on this a little bit, but it'd be great to hear from a couple chairs, maybe on the philanthropic side. One, how have you utilized philanthropic money that may have come in? Say, Tom, or one, how are you getting any new philanthropic money from anyone who wants to answer? But go ahead, Tom.
Well, yeah, the main thing that we have is innovation. All of us, I think, that's captivating. It's interesting, and it draws in somebody who's philanthropically oriented. Most of it comes from innovation coupled to, in most cases, a grateful patient. And so I think we still have that. We still have that formula. But I made a joke once that most big donors require a kale salad quotient. There's a number of lunches you have. I happen to be eating kale salads because of my spelt figure. But so there's a kale salad quotient to develop each donor because they need the personal one-on-one. And that's, of course, been devastated. And Zoom just doesn't replace that. I think there might be some anticipated changes in the tax law that's rippling out there that may cause some donors to think about this year when they normally wouldn't have. So it's not a total loss, but Zoom-based outreach draws more people at a less engaged level. I think we need to get back to kale salads as soon as we can.
Yeah. Well, at least with social distancing, I have a donor even next week that have to deal with an in-person first-time encounter that we're going to do in a safe way.
Yeah.
Introducing him to a new chief and trying to get up some interest in, say, supporting. So, and it's a first-time meeting. So it is hard, and it makes it more challenging. Other thoughts on that from any chair regarding philanthropic fundraising and development?
I think a lot of real philanthropic people use virtual mediums all the time. They're international. They have meetings all over the world. So I think this concept of the personal is very important, but I think we can also make use of their use of technology over decades. Keeping in touch with their operations around the world and engage in that way. I think that's one way of doing it. I think another way is to show how far our dollars can go.
Yeah.
And I think developing this concept of being more collaborative.
Right. I would also say among the donors that are already on your list, who are already like engaged with your department, when you're in a time of need, they will come out and help you. And keeping them up to date, and particularly if a young investigator, telling them about a young investigator issue, that will resonate with them if they're already on your list, and as opposed to a new donor who you're trying to bring in and haven't met before, but those that are on there. Louise, yeah, go ahead.
And also, I think, like, for example, I'm doing one next week, these more town hall type of meetings that are targeted at some particular population that have given or have given smaller amounts in the past, and also trying to be modest. Is it enough to pay for a fellow, for example? And then really talking about our junior investigators and our fellowships that may be at risk, I think really speaks to donors. So I think you might not get that huge one donor, but if you can reach out more people, even if it's for a lesser amount, it is helpful.
And development with us has worked really well. We've done some virtual now broadcasts where the development team has brought in all these donors online to hear something that they normally wouldn't hear, and that can spike interest. So we're getting close to the end, but I wanted to touch on one thing. We touched a little bit about pipeline, recruiting and developing talent. Matt, some thoughts. How do we not lose a generation of researchers during this pandemic?
Well, I think we've pretty much established in multiple domains today that video is where it's at. And, you know, I think we have to take advantage of that. There are multiple forums. Zoom is one in particular. They weren't designed for interviewing, but that's what they've become now. And in a way that allows us to screen more people than ever before, more quickly. I think it's probably the way we're going to have to go for hiring in the near future, because and a lot of times people can't come in. And I kind of think that this is going to be a model going forth past the pandemic, that we are going to be doing a lot of interviews remotely on Zoom or some other platform, much as we're doing our resident interviews this fall. So I think that's the way to go. I think people need to make sure that they are professional when they're interviewing, the same way as if they would be meeting in person. Maybe they need to wear a tie and make sure that their hair is looking nice and choose their backgrounds carefully. I think that if they're going to be multiple interviews, people have to be sort of in sync about what they're looking for in a candidate, using the same rigor that they would as for an in-person interview. So I think that's the way we need to go. That's our new pipeline for now. And, you know, that's what I think.
It's here. Well, it's a good point you raised. I just talked to my residency program director and said, have we given all our residents some kind of interview etiquette when you're interviewing for a fellowship? Because you're right, it is a little different. It's not like social media and you're doing a FaceTime with somebody. You're interviewing for a job. So she said, you know, that's a good idea. We better give them some tips. I think these have been great ideas and thoughts. We're all in this together. We're all doing everything we can to reactivate the research that's going on in our academic institutions, supporting our young investigators, trying to do what we can. We heard some great ideas, I think, tonight. I know we couldn't get to all the questions that are out there. We did try to record things for those, and obviously we're easy to find. You can always email us if there's a question out there. Again, thank you, first of all, to all the panelists. You were great. I appreciate all of your input and sharing best practices. Look forward to seeing you all in person when that vaccine gets out there. Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.